and not man's plan. The unbelieving Jews are comparable to Ishmael and to Esau, and the believing Jews were comparable to Isaac and Jacob. That contrast. Paul makes a similar dissertation in Galatians 3, that talks about this same kind of point. In verse 7 of Galatians 3, therefore you know only those who are of the faith are sons of Abraham. So he's saying faithful Christians today are sons of Abraham. Verse 27, something similar. Verse 29, if you are of Christ, then you're of Abraham's seed and heirs to the promise. So the Christian today, in the example there, and in the examples that we're reading in our text in Romans, the faithful Christian today is referred to as an heir of Abraham, a seed of the seed of Abraham. And how do we say that? Is that I'm physically can show I'm related to Abraham? Is that the point? Or is it a deeper point? How can we say as a Christian we're of the Abraham seed?
Through Christ.
The promise made. Through your seed, all nations will be blessed, right? And we would become heirs to the promise. Through Abraham's seed, who came? Christ, right? Christ came. And through Christ, we become children of God. So through that spiritual sense, we're related to Abraham through that fulfillment of the promise made. And so that you take that back to our text in Romans 9, the faithful Jew, the believing, obedient Jew that has obeyed the gospel of Christ is now being compared to Isaac and Jacob, the faithful Jews of years gone by, and those who were not God's chosen of the descendants, Esau and Ishmael. Those are being the unbelieving Jew, not of the chosen. And so it's a, what's the English teacher term? Metaphor, an analogy of a comparison, the representations of all of this is because the Jews in the first century were struggling to accept Christ, were they not? They struggled to accept Christ. Because if they said he's the Messiah, what did that mean? We missed him and we killed him. Kind of hard to look in the mirror, right? Said, our mission, according to the promise of Abraham, is they're going to deliver it, and we're looking forward to him. And we did such a good job with it, we missed him, and then we killed him. Oh, that's a thing most people struggle looking in the mirror to deal with. And so they struggled accepting that, and their centuries of tradition of the law indoctrinated into them. And now suddenly, instead of the law of Moses, we're talking about the law of Christ, the law of faith and God's grace, and they are struggling with it. And that's how he's trying to bring all this in and lay the big picture out for them, because God rejected them. And that's what we're going to, this whole situation. We know God rejected them because where did he turn in? God knew they were gonna, didn't he? Because he told Paul where you're going to end up going to preach to the Gentile. And Paul was a Jew. And so that's what this whole circumstance, because let's look on in verses 14 through 18. Because they were struggling with this. We're God's chosen people. Yes or no? Well, you were, yes. Well, then why would God reject us? That doesn't make sense. What do we do wrong? Verse 14, what shall we say then? Is there unrighteousness with God? Certainly not. For he says to Moses, I will have mercy on whomever I will have mercy, and compassion on whomever I will have compassion. Verse 16, so then it is not of him who wills, nor of him who runs, but God who shows mercy. For the scripture says to the Pharaoh, for this very purpose I have raised you up, that I may show my power in you, and that my name shall be declared in all the earth. Therefore he has mercy on whom he wills, and on whom he wills, he hardens. He poses a question, verse 1. Well, if God's rejected us, that's not fair. So is God unjust? Unfair. We like that, right? That word today. That's not fair. That's not fair. Well, it's a rhetorical question. Of course not. God did not demonstrate partiality by limiting his plan through Isaac and Jacob. Think about that a second. That's not fair. Why'd you pick Isaac and Jacob? Why'd you make them the chosen one? Today's world say, that's not fair. That's not right. I'm tall, good looking. Neither, but that's okay. Why not me? And then our text said, God chooses who he wills. It's his decision. God's the one that shows mercy. I will have mercy on who I will have mercy, verse 50, and I will have compassion on who God gets to make those decisions because he is God. It's God's mercy, thankfully, is based on him and his control and his power, and not dictated by anything that man does. Man in this world has demonstrated fallibility and unreliability, right? We talk about fairness and how important fairness are. Men and women today are the epitome of unfairness, right? And the grace of God to me, I would not want in the hands of an earthly judge. Would you, Andre? I want it in the flawless, perfect judge sitting by the right hand of God, Christ. This mercy that is spoken to of our text is reserved for those who trusted in and obeyed him. Solomon captured this point in Proverbs 28:13. He who covers his sins will not prosper, but he who confesses and forsakes them will have mercy. So if you paraphrase, if you do something wrong, cover it up. Sorry. But whoever says, I've done wrong and confess and leave that behind will have mercy. And that mercy, all that process is in the hand of God. God declares in our text here who he will accept and whose he's going to reject, because that's within his power, and his power is absolute, and his justice and fairness is perfect and unimpeachable. No one can accuse God about being unfair. If we do, it's not because of his sign. We're looking at it from our frame point. And God decides and gets to set the rules for his creation about what we have to do to obtain his mercy. And that's called the gospel. All we have to do is obey that. That's what God set up. If you do that, we'll get his mercy. That's in the purview of God himself, right? To decide what we should do to satisfy and to please him. And that goes to the hand of God himself. And then the example at the end of the text here in verse 17, talk about the Pharaoh. raised him up, put him in power and in position, so his power would be demonstrated through him. Because he had a hardened heart and wouldn't let the children of Israel go. And because of that hardened heart, gave God the opportunity to demonstrate his power through all those signs and wonders that were performed. He was able to show his power. So in our text, the Pharaoh is the non-believing Jew, is the Jew that rejected the Christ and rejected the gospel. And that unbelieving Jew has set himself or herself up against God's divine plan. God set a plan in place. And they said no. And in our illustration, in our text, he's using the Pharaoh now to illustrate those that turn their back on Christ and harden their heart against the gospel. I'm not going to say, no, not going to accept that. I'm not going to accept that because I've got to admit something about myself. And I don't want to do that. I don't want to look in the mirror. The Jews, the descendants of Abraham through Isaac and Jacob, were God's chosen people. He raised them up so that his power could be manifested through the coming of his son, that lineage that was preserved, and through a lineage of Abraham, through Isaac and Jacob, the Son of God came, the Messiah came. The Jews that rejected the Christ are like the Pharaoh, harden their hearts, and the gospel goes to the Gentile. That makes sense. There's a lot of words come out of my mouth at one shot. There's a lot of figurative language, representational or metaphorical language here. Pharaoh being an illustration, Ishmael being an illustration, Esau being an illustration of the non-believing Jew. And sometimes that use of that term confusing a little bit. People of Jewish descent that rejected the gospel is probably a clearer way of saying that. Any questions here? This whole discussion is going to be ongoing till we get to about verse 25, which a slight variation. He's still dealing with Israel's struggle with Paul telling them, you've been rejected by God. And they just, all these centuries we're struggling with. And he's going to kind of bring the point home at the end of this chapter. Luke.
I heard a thought one time that he also is referring more to the nations that resulted from Ishmael and Esau. So we got Esau and the Edomites. So it's, even though that class of people descended out of Isaac, that was not the group of people that God chose. He chose the Israelites. Same thing with Ishmael. They descended from Abraham, but that was not the group of descendants that God chose. So Jews, God sometimes changes classes of people that he doesn't admit anymore.
And I appreciate you bringing that point, because it just gave me an idea to kind of illustrate the point here. Jacob and Esau. Esau, why did Esau say, that's not fair? How come I'm not the chosen one? Okay. Yeah, and he was the older. But he gave up his birthright, remember? So, but that illustration about how come I wasn't chosen? Because that wasn't God's plan. So you fast forward today, the Jew that doesn't accept Christ, why is that not fair? That's not, same point. God has had his plan from the foundation, before the foundation, how this was going to work. And it wasn't because, suddenly, Oh, I'm not of the chosen nation, because my 3,500th great-grandfather is Esau. No, the point being illustrated is God has for all time had a plan where there were those appointed, and that's within his discretion and his power as God. And it didn't mean that Esau's descendants were bad people, but he appointed that. And that lineage brought about the Messiah, the Savior, and it was that lineage that brought about blessings. Now, the chosen people of God are of what lineage? That's a trick question. A sneaky question. So today, all through along, they had to be Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, of the lineage of David, to be God's chosen people. Today, who is God's chosen people? What lineage do we come from? That's exactly right. We're of Christ. We're sons of God. Adopted heirs. And so that's how we become the chosen today. And that all this is using the history of the lineage of the Jews and how he preserved Abraham's seed there were those that were chosen and all those that weren't chosen, okay? And he's using that illustration, fast forward, using those same kind of examples today. You have the ability to remain chosen, but you have to accept the law of Christ. You have to obey the gospel, and then you will. But that is available to everyone. Everyone. You're great. And it was illustrations that were very meaningful to the Jew, these illustrations, because that's who he was talking to in this particular chapter, very, very succinctly. And the notion that a Jew that didn't accept the gospel, when Paul tells them God has rejected you because you've hardened your heart against his word and against his son, they're struggling with that. He can't, because I'm of the seed of David. I'm the seed of Isaac and Jacob. He can't reject me. That leads us into this very next section, verse 19. You will say to me then, why does he still find fault? For who has resisted his will? But indeed, O man, who are you to reply against God? Will the thing that's formed say to him who formed it, why have you made me like this? Does the potter have power over the clay from the same lump to make one vessel of honor and another for dishonor? He clearly begins verse 19 saying, mankind cannot, the Jews being spoken to here, cannot impute injustice to God for his omnipotence, his power, and for the exercising of his will, because that's inherent in God himself. It's anticipated that the subsequent response was, why did God will me or make me to be guilty? Because he didn't. In our text, it says here in verse 20, will the thing formed say to him who formed it? We would say, would the created say to the creator? That's another way, the form versus those who formed it. Will the created say to him who created it, why have you made me like this? That's a good excuse, right? For those of us that are a day or two older, there was one of my a great comedian back in the 60s. I loved him. Oh, I just laugh and cry for half hour. Flip Wilson. He'd do something, he would do these skits, and he'd doing something he shouldn't do. Remember he said what his excuse was? Devil made me do it. All right. Why have you made me like this? This is the inbreak. God did not make us to reject him. God did not harm us. He gave, when he created man, in verse 21, we'll talk about this, the potter and the power over the clay. Who's the potter in this example? God, right? His hands. You got a lump of clay, and you can make one vessel for honor and dishonor. That goes back to what we've just been talking about. All right, he made Jacob and Esau. One was the lineage and one was the other. That was within the power of the Creator himself and part of his plan. You can't impute injustice just because of the lineage. Undoubtedly, here is a difficulty of the human mind reconciling how we as the created God through his divine will and his infinite power has created us and giving us something unique. What has God given each and every one of us? Free will. We have to choose. Now, if I was God, you and I can understand this point. That's why I'm trying to illustrate this, is it's more meaningful to God to have someone who chose him on their own as opposed to someone who was forced or compelled. You know, we used to, he saluted that captain in the army, whether you liked him or not, right? God wants you to choose him. God, and his people chose him, and that to the God in heaven is meaningful because they picked me over all else. And so that's why he gave us free will. He wants us to come to him. But by giving us free will, we can choose not to. And most of the world chooses the things of the world as opposed to choosing God.
You know, we take a look at this and we may say, as you were saying earlier, that this is unfair. You know, here's God. He chooses who he wants to have mercy on and compassion on, and it's his choice. Well, Jacob and Esau. But God, through his omnipotence, his omnipotent power, he knows how things are going to play out way down the road. He understands that. So he makes his choice. And certainly today, he's not left us without any knowledge of what pleases him. In Acts 10, 34, 35, Peter, he wrote to his Jewish Christian brothers, said, of a truth, I perceive that God is no respecter of persons.
Absolutely.
But in every nation, those who fear him and those who work righteousness is accepted with him. So God has not left us without knowing what he favors and what he likes. And he's going to choose what he favors and what he likes every single time. And that's righteous.
And he's told us what. We don't have to guess what it's going to be. He's told us what it's going to be. Luke, you got your hand.
Yeah, I was almost thinking that the Jews are almost kind of saying, well, why can Gentiles be saved now become a Jew? For thousands of years,
Yep.
they become a Jew to be saved. Now, why suddenly can they be saved? So Paul's telling them, you're wrong.
That's exactly. And you have to understand that all this tradition and the years and years of conditioning that they went through and the upbringing from their youth, it's hard to make all that go away. And It just is. You and I struggle with many times everyday life how we were raised, right? And we were raised and maybe conditioned a certain way, and maybe when we were converted, said we now know that was wrong, but it's hard to make that conditioning go away, right? That training, and so we have to work at that and work at that. That's just you and I in a generation. What about hundreds and hundreds and thousands of years, the conditioning of the Jew? That's a long time doing things this way over and over again to break that cycle, and realize you've fulfilled your purpose and mission, and the Messiah has come. Tie a bow on that mission, put it in the file, mission complete. Put it in the file cabinet. Now we have the law of Christ and the blessings to the entire world, and they're struggling to make that connection. And that plagued Paul throughout his ministry. These individuals that were more militant about, you still have to obey the law too. And they would follow everywhere Paul taught and set up a congregation. They would come in and create difficulties in that congregation after Paul traveled on. And so us over and over again wrestle with this issue. The thought continues in verse 22 and goes to 24. What if God, wanting to show his wrath and make his power known, endured with much long suffering the vessels of wrath prepared for destruction, that he might make known the riches of his glory on the vessels of mercy, which he prepared beforehand for glory, even us whom he called, not of the Jews only, but also of the Gentiles. These are more verses that were extremely difficult to read. But if we step back and look at, there's two groups being talked about here. In verse 22, there's a group that's prepared for destruction. Two groups that are being discussed, prepared. In verse 23, prepared for glory. Verse 23. So then you got the vessels of wrath are prepared for destruction. The vessels of mercy are being prepared for glory. That's the subjects of this verse. So the first, when it said the vessels of wrath prepared for destruction, the Greek here indicates they prepared themselves. And in the second verse, verse 23, he, the capitalized H, right? He's referring to God, prepared the vessels of mercy. So the preparation of the first group, the vessels of wrath, are individuals that prepared themselves for destruction. So that means those that disobeyed God, those that didn't choose God's way. Those that have chose God's way, God had a plan, and those that do my will receive my mercy. Vessels of mercy, vessels of wrath. Those that prepare themselves according to the ways of the world and not according to God's ways are vessels of wrath. Those will be individuals that are going to be subject to the wrath of God for their disobedience. The ultimate punishment one day. That will, all the evil those that rejected him will face. Even us, verse 24, whom he called, not of the Jews only, but of the Gentiles. He prepared beforehand for glory. We mentioned that earlier, right? God's plan was established before the foundation of the world. God knew man was going to mess up before he ever made the world. It was going to need a plan to be reconciled to him. And that plan was developed in God's mind before the foundation. So which he prepared beforehand for glory. He knew in advance those that obey him, he would show mercy to. even, and then verse 24, that thought continues, even us whom he's called, the Christian, not the Jews only, but also the Gentiles. And he poses that in a rhetorical question. He determined that. It's a rhetorical question. Those who, Jewish descendants, Gentile descendants, obey God, they are going to be vessels of mercy, and God said, I prepared them for glory. I prepared them for glory. Yes, sir.
You know, one of these key words that I see, and a lot of people always tend to judge God in that way. He says, his power known endures with much long suffering. It wasn't easy for God, even though those who chose to do evil, for him to punish them. He says he endured. I mean, he gave Pharaoh 10 opportunities. Options, the 10 plagues, and every time he would come back and say, okay, it's over, right? And again, he endured with that long suffering, and it's not the long suffering. The word means with a lot of pain. He's going through this with them, he's hoping, but in his heart he knows they're not content.
Good point. And you just, in your point there, we're talking about the long suffering of God. Does God show emotion? Example. We had such a uniform, yes, okay, give me some illustration. You don't have to give me chapter and verse.
The Bible said it grieved God in his heart that he made man.
Yeah, he was sorry. What else? He loved, grieve. What else?
Jesus said he cried. He cried. He said, how many times have I tried to gather you as a hand gathers the chicken? He's saying, you have filled the prophets, and he showed there that he's emotional.
Does God hate?
Yes, he understands.
Absolutely. The proverb writer told us that. Things that are an abomination. These things God hates. So we know God expresses all these emotions. So God, it grieved his heart. That's the interesting thing about when you think about omnipotence of God and that characteristic. The earth has not yet been formed, and it grieved his heart that he knew man, when I make him, is going to leave me. It's going to falter, and I'm going to have to reconcile. All before he ever made us, he knew that, and it grieved him. The question, some would pose that what these verses in verse 22 to 24 would say is, why are some of us saved and some of us condemned? That's what they would say a paraphrased version of that text means. And that's absolutely not what it is telling us. Why? Because in our own earlier studies in this book, who all deserves condemnation? Okay, I ask a bad question because that's correct. All have sinned and fallen short of the. That's what I was looking for. Who has sinned? Everyone. Who deserves condemnation because of that sin? Everyone. Even the child of God who sins deserves what? Condemnation for the sin they've committed. We have, according to 1 John chapter 1, we have ability to remedy that as a Christian that the rest of the world doesn't have. And not until they become an obedient child of God. The point here in our text, we'll close on this, is God's long suffering demonstrates his greatness, his goodness, his wisdom, and his power. Though worthy of God's wrath, because I'm human, I'm weak, I make mistakes, I sin. I'm a human. Worthy of God's wrath. Those who rejected God enjoy his long suffering so that we have an opportunity to obtain mercy through God's divine plan, through Jesus Christ. And it's not only to the Jew, but it's to the Gentiles as well, according to the promise of Abraham, to the entire world. to the entire world. Any other comment? The next section, starting in verse 25 to 33, which I think takes us to the end of the chapter, talks about to the benefit of trying to explain this, why God has rejected the Jew, they've rejected the law, God's rejected the law of Moses, was foretold by the prophets. And this section in these 7-8 verses will deal with that. And you have one spare minute left, and we'll just call class good right there. Appreciate everyone's participation, and we'll start in verse 25 next week.